Thank you very much, Nick, for that very kind introduction. Generally, when I speak about Russia before an audience this large, I realize that something has gone wrong with Russia, that Russia has done something bad in the world. When people come for 3 days to listen to about Russia, it's a lot worse than I thought it was. Now, my task is to talk a little bit about where we are in U.S.-Russian relations. Nick, yesterday, if I remember, you talked about a twilight struggle. I don't think you said the twilight zone, but a twilight struggle. And I would agree that with the Ukraine crisis, we've ushered in a new era in U.S.-Russian relations. All the hopes and assumptions that we had made 20 years ago about the inevitable, albeit slow, integration of Russia into the Western world have been upended in the past year and a half. Even if we resolve the Ukraine crisis miraculously tomorrow, no one in Washington is going to be talking about a reset, as President Obama did several years ago, nor of a strategic partnership or a strategic alliance with Russia, the way his predecessors did. There's going to be no return to business as usual after this crisis. And so what we need is a new approach for a new era that deals with the real Russia and not the Russia we had hoped for. So what is the real Russia? And what challenges does it pose to the United States and our European allies? 5 points. First, as much as we like to demonize Putin, Putin is not our problem. Russia is. As we all know, Putin enjoys the overwhelming support of the Russian people. His popularity soaring over to 80%, largely because of his defiance of the United States and the Western world over Ukraine. And they stayed over 80% despite the increasing socioeconomic problems in Russia. Similarly, we see that Putin enjoys the solid support of the elite, even if we hear some concerns about deteriorating socioeconomic conditions. But the more important point I would make is that Putin's foreign policy is well grounded in Russian history and strategic thinking. Like most Russians, he belongs to what I would call the great power school of international relations. He believes in sovereign states, inevitable conflict, hard power, and balance. And in Putin's world, it is good to be a great power. And Putin insists, like most Russian leaders, that Russia must be a great power if it is to survive in the 21st century. It must be a great power, that select group of powers that determine the structure, substance, and direction of global affairs. Putin shares a vision of Russia's place in the world with all his predecessors, be they presidents, general secretaries, or czars. Remember Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin, considered a great friend of the United States in the 1990s. But what Yeltsin realized, that Washington was not about to concede to Russia preeminence in the former Soviet space. He worked very hard to reduce American influence there. He reached out to France and Germany to try to blunt American power and influence in Europe. And he also reached out to India and China towards the end of his administration, his presidency, in order to form a global counterweight. Putin differs from Yeltsin, not so much in ambition as in capability. He can act where Yeltsin couldn't. And we see that most dramatically in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine today. And any predecessor or successor that we can imagine, a plausible successor to Putin, is going to pursue the same style or same substance in foreign policy. And granted that we're not going to see a leader riding horseback bare-chested or carousing with bikers. We'll see a change in style, but not a change in substance. And so we have a Russia problem and not simply a Putin problem. Now, this Russia problem is not new, despite what we might have thought over the past 20 years. And that's my second point. This problem emerged at the latest 200 years ago, after the French Revolution, with the opening up of what we would call today a values gap. In the 19th century, Russia remained an absolute autocracy with no formal limits on the Tsar's power and authority, while across Europe, the individual and freedom were advancing as the foundations of national political systems. Yet Russia remained an essential element of the European balance of power, as it had been since Peter the Great brought Russia into Europe at the beginning of the 18th century. For 150 years, up to the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia and Europe, Russia and the West, became a leitmotif of political discourse in Europe and in Russia. A discourse that accepted that Russia and Europe were inextricably bound together, but different in fundamental ways. And that theme has returned today. The challenge to Europe, the challenge to the West more generally, our Russia problem is ensuring our safety and security in the looming presence of an actor that is essential to peace on the continent of Europe, yet can never be fully integrated politically, economically, or ideologically. Now, we're going to defend and advance our own security. We need to understand how the Russians think about security. The imperative of strategic depth is critical to Russian thinking, and that's my third point. Now, Russia's security problem emerges from its location on this vast, sparsely populated, featureless Eurasian plain that stretches for thousands of miles from Eastern Europe to the Pacific, from the Arctic to Central Asia. Peoples and armies have moved easily across this territory throughout history, westward into Europe, eastward to the Pacific. In the 13th century, the Mongol hordes swept across the plain, conquered Russia, and threatened Europe. Tatars from Crimea sacked Moscow as late as 1571. And coming from the west, Napoleon entered Moscow in 1812, and Hitler reached its outskirts in 1941. To bolster security, the Russians have tried to push their borders outward to create strategic depth. And they've stopped not when they run into formidable physical obstacles, of which there are a few, but when they ran into well-organized, powerful states. Ultimately, the Germanic powers in the West, Great Britain, and then the United States in the South, and China in the East. And this dialectic of expansion and resistance came to define the Russian geopolitical space, its zone of influence and interest, as north-central Eurasia. That is, the former Soviet space, and also the former Russian imperial space, minus Finland and Poland. In the Russian mind, the states of this region, states of this space, do not face a choice between Russian domination and genuine independence. They face a choice between different great powers vying for power and influence in this region. And so, if a state is not in Russia's orbit, it is inevitably in the orbit of another power. The Russians would look at the Baltics and say that's a case in point. Part of the Soviet Union, and shortly after the breakup of the Soviet Union, in the Russian mind, absorbed into NATO and absorbed into the European Union, non-Russian entities. And so the Russians will do what they can to keep other great powers away from this region. Maintaining primacy in, if not necessarily direct control of, this region is critical to Russia's security in the minds of the Russian political elites. Now, beyond this geopolitical space, this traditional geopolitical space, I think Russia has had quite limited territorial ambitions, despite all the talk you hear about neo-imperialism at this point. Sure, Russia was in the center of Europe after the Second World War, and it remained there for 50 years. But it was there because of the tremendous vacuum of power created by the collapse of Nazi Germany, and it remained there because of the bitter struggle between the United States, or with the United States, in the Cold War to 1989, 1991. The Cold War is over. Those conditions no longer pertain, and Russia, up to this point, has made no effort to control territory beyond the borders of the former Soviet space. That said, and this is my fourth point, Russia has done what it can over the past 20 to 25 years to slow down, retard progress towards European unification. Russia, historically, has seen itself as a great power competing with other major powers on the great European battlefields, at the grand diplomatic conferences. Russia has never seen itself as working with a united Europe in solving and managing problems beyond Europe's border. And the reason is easy to understand. Russia can aspire to be the equal of a Germany, France, a Great Britain. But Russia can never be the equal of a united Europe, an entity that in population, wealth, technology, and power potential would dwarf Russia the way the United States dwarfs Russia today. And so Russia, in the current crisis, is doing what it can to exploit the fissures in and between European countries and between Europe and the United States in order to reduce the risk of the formation of a durable common front against Russia for its actions over Ukraine. So these 4 points suggest that there's been a great deal of continuity in Russian foreign policy, in the way the Russian elites have thought about their position in the world and their goals in the world. But there's one huge discontinuity, and that leads to my 5th point. And that is that Russia is no longer the dynamic core of Eurasia. Up to the breakup of the Soviet Union, it was otherwise. Russia was on the move. It was radiating power across Eurasia and into surrounding regions. Now, Resurgent Russia may be the title of this conference, and here I'm going to disagree with Nick. And it's true that Russia is stronger, is more active on the global stage than it was 10 to 15 years ago, thanks in large part to the policies pursued under President Putin, to other aspects of the international environment. But the larger truth, the more important truth in my mind, is that for the first time in modern history, Russia, beyond its traditional geopolitical space, is surrounded by states and regions, all of which are more dynamic than Russia is. We hardly have to talk about the East. a robust China. A robust China that is penetrating commercially into the Russian Far East and in Siberia. A China that has become the leading commercial partner of Central Asia in the past 5 years. In the South, we have this tremendous ferment that has spawned radical Islamic movements. Radical Islamic movements that are penetrating into Central Asia, into the Caucasus, and farther afield into the Muslim-dominated regions of Russia itself. And across the region, it is adding another element of instability to territories that are dominated by fragile states, pervasive corruption, and widespread poverty. And finally, to the west lies Europe, a continent that may be in disarray at the moment, but still exercises a tremendous attractive power on Russia's immediate neighbors. We're talking about the Ukraine crisis, after all. And one of the causes of that crisis is the attraction of Europe as an idea, as a society, as a polity, on a vast majority of the Ukrainian population. Now, nothing we've seen over the past several years suggests that Russia is going to regain this dynamism over the long term. We know that Russia is going to fall in a recession this year. It will probably continue into next year. It may continue beyond that. The Russian government, a year ago, produced a document that indicated that the Russian economy out to 2030 would grow at a rate that would leave it falling farther behind the United States, let alone China and India, the great emerging powers and markets on Russia's borders. We've seen over the past several years multiple programs proposed for how Russia could deal with its economic stagnation, how it could diversify, how it could modernize, how it could revive this economy. And there are many good ideas in these programs, but the problem has been, and continues to be, the lack of generating the political will to select any one of those programs and execute them in a reasonable fashion. So resurgent or not today, Russia has, I would argue, a troubled future. So how does the United States, how does the West deal with the Russia that I've described? A country that is seeking to rebuild its primacy in the former Soviet space, eroding European Union, while finding a way to restore its dynamism. Now, if my analysis is correct, what we face is a challenge, but a manageable challenge. Russia is not a rising revolutionary power that wants to overturn the system. Rather, to my mind, it is a power that is in decline, that is seeking to restore the historical foundations of its power in Europe and beyond. It strikes me, in a situation like this, there's no reason for alarmism. You see in much of the commentary in the West today. Russia is not our geopolitical enemy number one. As George Romney said a couple of years ago, he was wrong then, he's wrong today. But what we need in order to deal with this challenge is transatlantic unity and cooperation in mustering our resources in a calm fashion to deal with the problem that Russia faces or poses to us today. Now, in the first instance, the response, the appropriate response to the Russia challenge is to put our own houses in order. We need to deal honestly and effectively with the multiple domestic problems that all of us face. We need to demonstrate that the Western world can succeed, that we have a sense of who we are, and we know where we're going. We need to do this for ourselves to restore our confidence, but we also need to do it to regain respect abroad, including inside Russia. If we look at this more specifically, look at Europe, where the challenge is probably greatest at this point. Europe needs to focus its energy on dealing with the problems that have created the fissures that Russia is now exploiting. The democratic deficit, an elite that has not paid sufficient attention to popular concerns in Europe, the failure of the European elites to generate a durable economic recovery, all this has fueled the anti-EU sentiments that we see across Europe today. This drive to attract capital without thinking through the consequences of bringing in flows of money of dubious origin, the corrupting influence of that, and it's not only from Russia, it's elsewhere in the world, also has a negative impact on Europe today. And I could dare to say, if we look at the Baltics more specifically, a less than welcoming attitude to the ethnic Russian minorities creates a potential vulnerability of ethnic unrest. So European countries, the United States, need to focus their attention and energies on these matters first of all. So the response is largely a socioeconomic one. Now, to be sure, it has a military component, and the United States needs to do what it can to demonstrate that it will honor its commitment to collective defense. And so it's appropriate that the United States, along with its other NATO allies, has stepped up NATO's presence along the long border with Russia. It's appropriate that we're doing more robust contingency planning. But I would argue that we do not need to spend a lot more on defense. Our NATO European allies already spend 4 times as much as Russia does. What we need to do is obviously spend that money more efficiently. We need to coordinate our policies more effectively. What we need to avoid is militarizing this conflict with Russia now the way we militarized the Cold War 70 years ago. Now, the second thing that we need to do, if we're indeed worried about Russia's expansion into the former Soviet space, is we need, as history suggests, to build capable states, prosperous economies. At the top of the list, obviously, today is Ukraine. It is going to take billions of dollars over many years to help the Ukrainians build a reasonably functioning state, to tame corruption, to repair its economy, and to forge a national consensus. And of course, the Ukrainians themselves have to demonstrate the political will and ability to do that. All of this is going to be much harder to do if there's a war going on in eastern Ukraine. And so, distasteful as it may be, at this moment, it really is, I think, a responsibility of the United States, Europe, Ukraine, working with Russia and on Russia to produce, as quickly as possible, a durable ceasefire. That means freezing the conflict so that Ukraine can focus on the very important and urgent task of domestic reconstruction. Third, there's a little need for some sanctions against Russia, and we have levied some. We need to demonstrate our moral outrage at Russia's violations of very central principles to European security and world order. But I would argue that we need to use these sparingly, and they need to be well targeted. A radical weakening of Russia, something that will occur if we strengthen the sanctions and keep them in place over a long time, leads to 2 other long-term risks for the United States and Europe. A liberal democratic breakthrough has never been the response to chaos inside Russia. Think to 1917 and the Bolsheviks. Think to Putin after the breakup of the Soviet Union and the chaos of the 1990s. And as Nikolai Petrov demonstrated to us yesterday, the successor to Putin is not likely to be better than Putin himself. Second, a weakening Russia through Western sanctions drives Russia in the direction of China, and China will take advantage of Russia to our detriment and to its benefit in the years to come. And the other reason that sanctions are a problem is that they don't solve the problem that we face in Ukraine. At the end of the day, we can only solve the Ukraine problem if Russia is involved in some way. Russia provides about 60% of Ukrainian gas. It was a major market for Ukrainian goods. You're not going to be able to repair the economy without Russia being involved in some way. Russia is too engaged. Its interests are too much at stake. It has too much of an ability to meddle in Ukraine for us not to deal with them. And at the end of the day, if we're not prepared to provide the billions of dollars over the many years that are necessary, we don't have the patience to do this. And my guess is that we probably don't at this point. Then there's even more reason why you're going to have to accommodate Russia to some extent. So at the end of the day, it's accommodation, while we still maintain our fundamental principles. Now, this is my last point, and I would make a broader point, which is we're going to deal with Russia. If we're going to try to work with Russia to solve some of the problems that we have in the areas of nonproliferation, counterterrorism, energy security, regional security, we're going to have to accommodate their interests to some extent. The solutions we will arrive at won't be ideal, but they'll be pragmatic, workable ones that will allow us the space and the time to advance our interest over the longer term. I also think it's wrong to think that we can isolate and contain Russia. You can't do that in a globalized economy any longer. And in the multipolar world that is emerging out of the current turmoil in world affairs, it is geopolitical malfeasance to radically weaken a country that needs to be a fundamental element in the global balance of power. So we need to practice resistance and accommodation in large terms in our relationship with Russia. We need to practice a new form of great power diplomacy. Now, this has a venerable tradition, even though it is something that appears novel, I think, to many of this generation of American decision-making. It certainly lacks moral clarity. It's a messy type of environment. It involves trade-offs that can be easily portrayed as compromises of principle. But it is a type of approach to global affairs, to Russia in particular, that has been practiced and practiced well in European policy, in foreign policies in the 18th and the 19th century. Now, I know that we've spent a lot of time maligning the 19th century and great power diplomacy. It certainly lacks moral clarity. But I think we also need to remember, as we look forward to how the world is going to operate in the years ahead, that the 19th century was also a period of relative peace and security, of prosperity and progress. And those are the types of things that we want going forward. So a return to a great power diplomacy, updated for the current situation, but the one that builds on a tradition that is rich, actually, in possibilities. Thank you.